There have been others who were a lot more rosy about the prospect of a post-war Taliban leadership, and I think hopeful that leadership wouldn't play host to terrorists and wouldn't be a cause of instability. We all believe that both India and China, sort of at their top leader levels, appreciate the threat and don't want to go to war. If you're trying to place pressure on or coerce or incentivize any government, you need to understand what makes them tick. So when it comes to remnants of Al-Qaeda or ISIS, or even TTP, where the United States has no love for TTP, and obviously Pakistan sees it as a serious threat, there should be room for practical cooperation. The U.S. Embassy in Islamabad is eager to partner with Pakistan on areas of economic and social development and progress in some areas.
Hello and welcome to Infer Talks, a podcast where we bring you some of the biggest thought leaders from around the world. My guest today is author of two renowned books, No Exit from Pakistan and China's Western Horizon. He's also a senior advisor at the U.S. Institute of Peace. With me today is Dr. Daniel Markey. Dr. Daniel Markey, welcome to Infer Talks.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see you.
Dr. Daniel Markey, I would like to start our conversation from this very first question focusing on Afghanistan. But let me draw your attention to a terror attack that took place in Peshawar, which ended up killing multiple people and has injured a score of individuals. Unfortunately, we've seen that Taliban has given multiple commitments while in its negotiations with the United States at Doha, that it would make sure that the Afghan soil is denied any kind of use to terrorist organizations, as well as committed to meeting some of their commitments with respect to human rights. How do you think that the international community could go forward in terms of compelling Taliban to meet some of their commitments?
Yeah, first of all, let me say this attack is horrible and obviously should be condemned by everyone. And it's just it's really tragic, of course, for those who have suffered and are suffering. And I think that it points to a deeper and, if I could even say it, more troubling reality that Afghanistan under the Taliban continues to be a problem for security for Afghans themselves, obviously for Pakistanis to the extent that they suffer from the consequences of terrorism that seems to have a home in Afghanistan. And I think from an American perspective, also very worrisome for those reasons, as well as the potential that we could revert back to a reality that looks something too similar to what we faced before 9/11, and where international terrorists that can find safe haven in Afghanistan. And your question is an apt one. That is, how could the world put more pressure on Afghan Taliban to live up to their promises, in a sense? And the short answer is we can't. We haven't. We won't. I don't want to make this too simple, but the United States was effectively at war in Afghanistan for 20 years, came away unconvinced that it could advance its aims against the Taliban militarily and through that kind of pressure. There have been others who were a lot more rosy about the prospect of a post-war Taliban leadership, and I think hopeful that leadership wouldn't play host to terrorists and wouldn't be a cause of instability or a threat to itself or its neighbors. And I think that the past year plus now has suggested that those views were too optimistic. But in terms of practical policy responses, the United States is not eager to get back involved in a direct way. And the outside forms of pressure that we have on Afghanistan are, if anything, less powerful than we had when we were at war. So that leaves us in a serious conundrum. And I think Pakistan is finding unfortunately, that it is suffering the consequence, again, of I think, miscalculations on the part of many, including Pakistan's leaders, who I think expected that they would have more leverage and more capacity to work with or deal with at least this new Afghan leadership. And that hasn't been the case. So I'm very worried about what comes next.
So, Dr. Dan, you actually suggested that U.S. would not be intervening directly in Afghanistan once again, and for valid reasons. What do you then think would be possible for the international community and also the United States to then engage Taliban to have them meet their commitments?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Afghan Taliban. What I think it is important for us to appreciate what motivates. If you're trying to place pressure on or coerce or incentivize any government, you need to understand what makes them tick and what leads them to make one decision versus another decision. And there are some leaders out in the world who are highly incentivized by external drivers. That is, they care about what the rest of the world thinks about them. Maybe they're leaders of democracies where their own people care about what the rest of the world thinks of them. Or maybe they're highly dependent on external support and assistance for their very survival. And so there you find that you have certain avenues of leverage. Afghan Taliban leadership are far less constrained than many other states by the outside world, and coercing them from the outside. Many of the steps that one might take have a greater chance of hurting the Afghan people than they do of forcing a hardened Taliban leadership that has suffered or believes that it has suffered and has been pretty ruthless in its ability to extract resources from its own people and survive over these years. So how do you leverage or how do you place pressure on a group like that? One way is you go to war against them. But we tried that. As I say, we're not going back. You might think that withholding international legitimacy or continuing to keep them on a tight leash financially would be sufficient to get them to come to the table. But clearly, even on issues that we care a great deal about, like international terrorism, I don't believe that that's having the desired effect. So we are left in a bind. I think that sitting here in Washington, the other thing to keep in mind is, if there were some set of policy options that offered a reasonable prospect for success at a reasonable cost, the U.S. government would have already undertaken them. But the fact of the matter is, right now, such suggestions just simply don't exist. So we're in a bit of a waiting game, and we'll see what happens.
Right. So you were here last year in September in Pakistan. And during those discussions, we saw that different people who were also accompanying you were discussing various areas where both Pakistan and the United States can actually take forward their collaboration. But we sort of see these two countries finding themselves in the same old spot. And I want to allude to your famous phrase, no exit from Pakistan. Do you see the possibility of both Pakistan and the United States re-engaging in some form of counter-terror cooperation once again? And if so, how do you see this being different than the past engagement?
Look, the logic of that, the no exit book, the broader logic is simply that the kinds of problems that face the United States in and around Pakistan 20 years ago and 15 years ago and 10 years ago and 5 years ago and now are roughly the same. And they continue to worry U.S. government officials, as I think they should. What had changed was clearly the U.S. military withdrawal from Afghanistan and a depth of frustration with respect to our partnership with Pakistan that led many U.S. policymakers not to see that kind of deep and wide work with the Pakistani state as ultimately advancing U.S. goals. My argument in No Exit from Pakistan was that it was worth trying. Of course, that book came out in 2013. So what I wanted was the United States to try harder and for Pakistan to try harder. I think since then, there's been some of that. There's been a great deal more of frustration. And so my takeaway from this is that the troubles remain, but the old solutions are probably either politically unrealistic or practically not going to happen. So that leads me to focus more narrowly on some very specific kinds of threats that I think are security threats, terrorist threats that are felt mutually by the United States and Pakistan, and to anticipate that at least we could cooperate on those. So when it comes to remnants of Al-Qaeda or ISIS, or even TTP, where the United States has no love for TTP, and obviously Pakistan sees it as a serious threat, there should be room for practical cooperation between Washington and Islamabad. What's missing is a sense of a broader strategic partnership, which was the hope years ago that we would, through our cooperation, find a way to advance that. That ambition has been sapped. That doesn't mean it would never come back, but I don't perceive that it's likely anytime soon. Probably not during the Biden administration, and I would be wondering whether any subsequent U.S. president would want to go down a similar path again. So what we're looking at is a narrowed version of, if not cooperation, at least overlapping efforts to address specific security threats and maybe also some other challenges as well.
Right. And so under these narrow areas, could you identify very briefly 2 to 3 areas that you see going forward?
Well, the United States would definitely like to, as I say, focus on high-level counterterrorism. There is still the United States, as it left Afghanistan, the pledge was made by the Biden administration that it would continue what it described as over-the-horizon counterterrorism. That is, that the United States could continue to strike its enemies even if it didn't have a physical military presence on the ground in Afghanistan. And I think that that continues to be an aim for the US government. And to some extent, even if it just means being able to fly over Pakistani territory, it requires a degree of cooperation with the state of Pakistan. And I think that continues, and I think that's important. So we shouldn't minimize areas where the United States works with Pakistan in ways that it can't work, say, with Iran. Our relationship is still considerably better than that. On other areas, I would like to see more, and I think we are seeing some. The U.S. Embassy in Islamabad is eager to partner with Pakistan on areas of economic and social development and progress in some areas. I think Pakistan is obviously facing many challenges other than terrorism, flooding. Your economic environment is near catastrophic at this point, and obviously there's a desire to find solutions to that. There are other sort of broader or maybe long-term areas where the United States and Pakistan, certainly there's no reason why we can't be working in areas like education and so on, where obviously the United States has an interest. But those, this is, I think, striking in its narrowness and lack of ambition as compared to what it might have been, again, 10 or 15 years ago. One last area would be crisis management. There is still a concern, at least in some circles in the United States, that Pakistan's relationship, certainly with Afghanistan, but also with India, continues to be very problematic, and the dangers there are very high for everyone involved. Not least because Pakistan and India both have nuclear weapons and large conventional militaries, and so the potential for something to really get out of control is, even if still small, is still worrisome. And so that's another area where the United States would, I think, find opportunities and pursue opportunities for narrow cooperation with Pakistan, certainly in the midst of a crisis. And I think smartly, it would be smart for us to be thinking about how to work with Pakistan before a next crisis so that our communication is better and our ability to make sure that miscalculation, miscommunication, or accidents don't lead to a worse kind of crisis going forward.
Dr. Dan, now I'd actually ask you to step back a little and basically zoom in on the ongoing competition between the US and China. We've seen very recently last year, President Xi and President Joe Biden meet in Indonesia. Both sides had actually expressed their willingness to work on areas such as debt relief, health security, and global food security. How do you see these two great powers going forward and working to prevent any kind of future crisis along these areas in future? And as they go forward, do you see any possibility of avoiding any kind of crises as they go forward, mitigating some of these major challenges?
Yeah, look, the mood here in Washington, and I think globally, really with respect to the United States and China, really is focused on the deepening divide between them, the potential that that divide could even go so far as to become an outright military conflict, say over Taiwan, that the potential for their competition to become something more than just a friendly competition, but something that's actually quite challenging, not just for the two of them, but for other countries that are caught in the middle of it. That's where the focus lies. And here in the United States, a lot of the conversation has focused on words like decoupling, where the issue is how do we separate parts of the US economy from the Chinese economy? How do we protect certain industries and technologies in our competition with China so that the Chinese don't use them to get ahead or otherwise expose vulnerabilities to the of the United States or take advantage of supply chain issues. The United States basically has woken up in this era of COVID and competition with China to a reality that actually was looming for quite some time, which is that we had become, in many critical ways, highly dependent upon our relationship with China in ways that actually had a security and political diplomatic component to them that most Americans were sort of blissfully unaware of. They were pleased with the benefits of global trade and the low cost of Chinese manufactured goods and the opportunities that that created both for US consumers and for US companies to do well and to make money and to save money. And that efficiency, and sort of in shorthand, the efficiencies of globalization were very, very appealing to the United States, just as they were for many, many other countries, pretty much every country around the world. But they came with downside potential risks, the risks that China would turn certain US created technologies into advantages for its own firms, might steal those types of technologies, say in semiconductors and other computer technologies, steal them and use them to make Chinese companies more capable and leapfrog American competitors, or even use the data collected from, say, Chinese-made software that Americans were using, harvest that data to either better understand what Americans are up to in a nefarious sense, that is spying, or simply make use of it as in this new economy where vast stores of data enable artificial intelligence and other advances technologically that would give China a different kind of edge. So the United States has been looking at that and really focused on the downside risks. And that's where all the conversation pretty much has been going. But that doesn't eliminate all the other areas where the United States and China remain connected. I mean, when I buy something here in the United States, almost every time when it shows up, it somehow made its way here from China, whether I buy it from Amazon or Walmart or any other store. Made in China is quite likely. So we're still very interconnected with the Chinese economically. We're totally interconnected with the Chinese and every other country when it comes to issues like climate change. And many others as well. Of course, COVID being a principal example of how public health is not stopped at a nation's border. So when we think about those kinds of global challenges, we have to simultaneously, that is, the United States has to simultaneously think about how do we compete? How do we close opportunities for China to take advantage of our vulnerabilities or to otherwise advance its aims above ours, while also cooperating on areas where the only solution is one that's agreed upon mutually. And that's really hard. And, there's a tendency now to think about the United States and China in a kind of a Cold War model, that is, two superpowers competing on the world stage. And when we think about it that way, we tend to remember that in the last Cold War, it took a long time before the United States and the Soviet Union were able to find anything approximating a kind of a normal, stable relationship where they could address other issues. And we called that détente. We are not in a period of détente with China yet. And that isn't to say that this Cold War or whatever it is we have with China will be the same as the previous Cold War. It's just to say we haven't found a stable equilibrium where we and the Chinese are convinced that cooperating in certain areas doesn't harm us in our competition in others. And navigating to that is, I think, the challenge of our generation, is figuring out how can American companies continue to do business even in China, say Apple Corporation or other major Tesla or other major manufacturers make money in China without becoming beholden to the Chinese state. And how do we navigate the rules and regulations associated with that? How do we, coming back to other crisis management, how do we find a way to talk to the Chinese about the fact that they're building a significantly larger nuclear arsenal in ways that make them comfortable and make us comfortable? Until we get to that, and we eventually got there with the Soviet Union, and that wasn't the end of that story, and who knows how this one will go. But we eventually got there, and it was important. It was stabilizing to be able to at least have those conversations with Soviet counterparts. Right now, we're not having serious conversations. You hear President Biden use the word guardrails in the relationship. We need to develop guardrails in our relationship with China. That's a way of signifying that U.S. policymakers are nervous that we do not have barriers to our competition spiraling out of control in really deeply dangerous ways. When they look at what's happening in Taiwan, or they look at China's nuclear program, or they look at its use of cyber technologies or other predatory economic actions, they fear that these things could spark a serious conflict. And they want to find ways to actually have conversations before that happens, before things get out of hand.
So very quickly, Dr. Dan, can we, build some kind of guardrails to take cooperation in areas like these, which affect the global community at large, and areas which would certainly not, or would not have to have any kind of unhealthy competition between the two great powers?
Well, look, it's proving to be incredibly difficult. I'll give you just a specific example on COVID-19. This obviously came from China. This obviously went from China to countries around the world. Forget about conspiracy theories, just in terms of basic facts, the Chinese have not come forward to share basic public health data, either at the origin of COVID-19 or now as they are suffering their own huge outbreaks. That kind of behavior is the kind of thing that really raises serious questions about the ability to cooperate on basic issues which are mutually necessary and of mutual interest. If we can't cooperate on public health when a major pandemic strikes, how are we going to be able to cooperate on far more sensitive things like nuclear missile and other capabilities? It's very worrisome. And so, that's what the rest of the world should be demanding. When other foreign leaders meet with the Chinese, I think their tendency is to take what they can get, because they see, they look at their bottom line, see their economic interests with the Chinese. But they should also be asking, these other tough questions. It's very hard, and the United States is trying to do that. But those are the transparency necessary to have those conversations is the way that we begin to get cooperation and at least guardrails that help the global community or at least other states as well as the United States.
I want to now take you back to South Asia very temporarily and speak about the ongoing tensions between China and India, especially the recent ones that took place near Tawang sector. You being someone who's written so much on crisis management and crisis stability, how important do you think is for both India and China to have some sort of crisis management mechanism, or to at least resuscitate them to, prevent any kind of serious crisis from taking place once again in the future? Or do you see that it would be perhaps wishful thinking and we could have some kind of flashpoint in the near future in this area?
Look, flashpoint is quite possible. We've written about it at the U.S. Institute of Peace over the past year. We'll continue to do work on this. I and some of my other colleagues are nervous and concerned about the possibility that these continued skirmishes along India's border with China could turn into something more violent and more dangerous. It is obviously in the interests of the world to see India and China figure out a way to get back to a situation where they were better able to manage their border disputes peacefully rather than violently in the way that they have over the past several years. We don't see significant enough progress on these issues. The latest violence, which took place in early December, was something that the Indian government tried to downplay, presumably because it didn't have a great solution to it, and presumably because it felt it was basically under control. But by the accounts that I've read, at least several hundred Chinese forces struck an Indian base. And this is not just something that happens by accident. This is something that had to have been planned, that had to be premeditated, that reflects a continuing disagreement tactically over where to draw these lines, and a sense, it seems, on the Chinese side, that it can do these things, get away with them, and that it advances China's agenda along this border. When you see that kind of thing happening, you have to ask what happens if more people die and the stakes go up and some of the new forces that have been brought closer to the border actually get drawn in, artillery, missiles, and so on. Where does that end? We all believe that both India and China, sort of at their top leader levels, appreciate the threat and don't want to go to war. But sometimes the pressures and the frictions and as they say, the fog of war can lead to poor decisions in the moment that then lead to other poor decisions and confusion, and that can lead to real trouble. So that's the kind of thing we're worried about. We'd certainly like the Indians and the Chinese to develop a better mechanism for discussions. They have these military to military commander level meetings every so often. They don't seem to be resolving all of their disputes. It seems like that's the principal channel for discussion on these border issues right now. It seems to me like additional channels should be opened at the diplomatic level. And, this is a year of big diplomacy for India. So I think New Delhi has every interest in making sure that it doesn't go off the rails and that Chinese leader Xi Jinping comes to India, certainly for the G20, ideally, I imagine also for the SCO summit. So there's every incentive to make sure that this doesn't get worse, certainly from the Indian side, and we'll see how the Chinese will play it. But this comes back to my earlier point about a lack of transparency in terms of Chinese decision making. We do not understand what the Chinese are doing, and they don't seem to feel the need to explain themselves to the world. And so under those circumstances, it's hard to figure out how to respond effectively when we don't even really understand what's driving this.
Dr. Dan, if I can borrow from your book title, taking our discussion to China's Western horizon and towards West Asia, we've recently seen China and GCC undertake a mutual summit. And in that summit, a joint statement came out which actually criticized Iran. And on the other hand, we see that both Iran and China have a strategic partnership in place. What do you seem to be seeing when China appears to be taking such a drastic position when it happens to have a strategic partnership in place with Iran?
Well, China is actually in the Middle East in an enviable position with respect to both Iran and the Gulf countries. China is a massive energy importer, and they are heavily dependent upon sales to China in terms of their exports to keep their economies afloat. That's true for Iran. That's true for all the Gulf countries, or nearly all of them. So under those circumstances, China can basically get away with a lot. It can have a strategic partnership with Iran and then go to Saudi Arabia and have a deepening strategic partnership with Saudi Arabia as well. There are a few countries that can manage this kind of balancing act. Certainly the United States does not. The United States has found itself on one side or the other in these disputes of the region. But I imagine China can continue to do this. Iran has no serious alternative to China in terms of cooperative relationship. No one else to buy its oil, no one else willing to more or less circumvent certain types of sanctions. And so China can do this. China's principal aim in this visit was to expand upon an already reasonably strong relationship with the Saudis and the other Arab Gulf states. And it does so to some extent as evidence of China's global leadership and of an expanding Chinese footprint, at least politically and economically, across the region and the world. And we'll see where that goes. But one way to look at all of this is the development, almost a natural and organic development of what happens when you become a great power, and that's what China is doing. It's in the process of being a great power, a superpower, and that means that its influence and capabilities do not stay simply at home. It means that everybody cares about what China thinks and does, and that will continue to be the case going forward.
Dr. Dan, let me ask a leading question. I mean, we have countries like India that do business with Iran as well in terms of importing oil. But, it would be unexpected of Iran to take a position similar to that vis-a-vis Iran. So why does that, place China in a different position, say, versus India? Or why India would not take a position like that when it comes to such policy statements?
I don't know what specifically motivated the Chinese on this issue. There have been some interesting moves by Chinese diplomats over the years. I believe there was one instance where the Chinese came together and were somewhat more critical of Pakistan, and did so in a multilateral setting with India. Sometimes I'm not fully convinced that the Chinese appreciate the specific nuances of the kinds of statements that they make when they go to visit, say, Saudi Arabia, when they say something about Iran. They may not fully appreciate the implications of that, or they may, as I'm saying, simply calculate that that the downside risks are something worth bearing in order to advance a partnership with the Saudis. So I don't, it's hard. Again, a lack of transparency. The Chinese do not feel the need to explain themselves, not in a way that I understand that is, and it's not just linguistic problems. They simply don't feel the need to describe or explain, justify to their own people or to the world what they do. So we're left wondering, why do they do these things? It's a problem, and that gets at the heart of the case of why many Americans find China worrisome. If we had a better understanding of what makes their system work, if it was more transparent and accountable to its own people, maybe we would be less nervous about what it's doing in the world. But that is certainly not the case.
So, Dr. Dan, coming back to West Asia, United States has traditionally been the great power partner of the Gulf countries. Now, will the recent outreach by China affect the United States' longest existing partnership with Gulf? And do you think it is a one-off competition for the U.S. in the Gulf?
Look, let's not make too much of one trip or any specific deals that the Chinese struck with the Saudis or all the fine words that they may use for one another, because the depth of U.S. involvement in this part of the world and the history of U.S. involvement and simply the sheer volume of U.S. involvement, particularly in terms of military sales and the kinds of technologies that have been sold to the Saudis in particular and to other Arab Gulf states in general, so overwhelm anything that the Chinese are doing that it's not even a close comparison. Now, having said that, so too is the depth of Chinese economic involvement in the region and the potential for expansion of that involvement, that none of these states can afford to see their futures in any way other than one that connects them with Chinese markets. When they think about who's going to be building their cities of the future and who's going to be buying oil for decades to come, probably, they have one answer, and it's usually China at the top. So, so given that interest, they have a desire to broaden and deepen their ties with the Chinese. There's also always been a kind of an uncomfortable relationship between the Saudis and the United States. We simply are very different societies, very different kinds of governments, very different types of politics, and that's played out in small and large ways, a large one being 9/11, and the sense in the United States that Saudi Arabia was deeply involved in that, and concerns about how Saudi policy ultimately led to that kind of an outcome. So though we continue to partner with the Saudis on important things, we also have serious issues with them. And they know that. And they have serious issues with us. And those frictions make them open-minded to the possibility of relations with other states, like the Chinese or like the Indians. And they're pursuing all of them. And so as the Chinese become more powerful and continue to be quite wealthy, and as they develop new technologies, the Saudis will be looking to weigh different options. And as others have said, and as I wrote in my book, they want to have multiple partners. Being married to the United States is no longer sufficient for these countries and for so many other countries around the world. And that's a practical reality that we face.
So, Dr. Dan, then how would you draw a distinction between the Middle East being a theater of US-China competition versus that of rivalry?
Competition versus rivalry? I mean, look, competition in the United States is typically, we think of competition in a kind of a value neutral way. That is, there can be good competition, friendly competition, healthy competition, where everybody kind of does better by competing. Even in our business community, you can have major companies competing for market share, and it actually spurs them on to technological advances and so on. That might not otherwise happen if they didn't have that competition. So we have kind of in our minds a sense, certainly in a capitalist society, that there's energy and growth inherent in healthy competition. Rivalry often is described more as a zero-sum way. I think that's the description, right? If you win, I lose. There's no winning together or healthy element to it. And I think that's where, if you see, say, China's relations with a given country improving, does that naturally mean that their relations with the United States will get worse? And so that's the kind of rivalry that I think we may be nervous about. We to the extent that countries continue to and increasingly find that they have economic ties with the Chinese, does that mean that they have to say vote against the United States in the United Nations General Assembly, or take on board other Chinese aims like China's position on Xinjiang or on Tibet or on Taiwan? If those are the cases, that's where we see rivalry. That's where we see China forcing countries to make decisions that are different from what the United States would prefer, because it's using its economic leverage in ways that are zero-sum. It's either with us or against us. And of course, countries don't like that. And they haven't liked it when we've approached them with a with us or against us kind of pledge. And I think they should be somewhat nervous and worried about it when the Chinese do as well.
But for the clarity's sake, if the countries were making those decisions independently, out of their own free choice, would then that be a problem between the two sides?
Well, I think it depends on the country. There are countries out there where the United States might see them as quite strategically important. At some level, the Saudis are continue to be, whether we like it or not, strategically important in terms of their massive share of global oil production. That makes what happens in Saudi Arabia important to the world. Even if the United States is no longer one of the largest importers of Saudi oil, even if the United States becomes energy independent, it will still matter to global markets which way the Saudis go. So we have an interest in what's happening there in terms of that competition. And indeed, you're right, rivalry. Other countries, no, we don't have much of an interest. We would see potential concerns about if they work more closely with the Chinese, what that will mean for those countries themselves. But in terms of on the world chessboard, those countries occupy less interest to the United States or to the international community. And then there are other places that are, close American partners and allies where we do want to help them, in a sense, resist Chinese pressures in ways that obviously those countries would like to resist. So the Australians, for instance, have felt tremendous Chinese economic pressure to cave to Chinese demands on various political issues. And it is in the United States' interest to work with the Australians, who are a democratically elected state, to help them resist. And that would be a very different kind of example of where the United States has an interest in helping. And maybe it looks more rivalrous, certainly from the outside, but these countries themselves are asking for U.S. assistance and U.S. partnership along the way.
And Dr. Dan, as an analyst focusing on China, do you also see China's footprint expanding in the Gulf countries with respect to defense-related cooperations or the sales of, defense-related equipment as well?
Yeah, probably. I mean, we're seeing that in some narrow ways, things like drone technologies where the Chinese have an advantage. Historically, the Chinese have exported missile technology to the region where either those countries like Iran didn't have many options, or countries like the Saudi Arabia might have liked to import them from the United States, but the United States was unwilling to share certain types of technologies, and the Chinese were willing to sell those. So I think those will all expand. Look, the Chinese are in some ways gradually, it seems, inheriting a lot of Russian technologies and then building upon them with their own new technology. And so that will be attractive to the world. And then, as I say, certain areas like cyber and so on, the Chinese are well out ahead of many other countries. And so they have a lot to offer at relatively low prices for these countries, which have both civilian and military application. So I think we'll see a greater Chinese footprint in all of these spaces.
Dr. Dan, largely focusing on, international politics now, we've seen countries being very aversive to the idea of joining a particular camp if the US-China competition happens to spill over into some kind of a rivalry. I want to ask you, what scenarios threaten the practice of such policy by smaller countries or middle powers?
Yeah, this is central to the argument in my last book, is that many countries, they get a vote too, just because the United States and China now look more like superpowers and do have a lot of influence over them. Every country in the world, even some of the smallest, have various options available to try to play that either to their advantage or to resist some of those outside pressures. And I anticipate we will continue to see that kind of dynamic playing out. So my view for the United States is often that, we should be approaching other countries, particularly those that we have no problem with, where we would like to cultivate a better and closer relationship. We should be approaching them on their own terms. That is, rather than saying, hey, you're either with us or against us in a global competition with the Chinese, we should approach them by saying, hey, what are the kinds of challenges that your society faces, and where are there areas for mutually beneficial cooperation with the United States? That's a message that both goes over better and is more likely to retain a degree of U.S. engagement and involvement in these societies as compared to this other much more competition or rivalry focused message. So that's what we should be doing. And in terms of these societies, they should appreciate that, yes, there are outside influences. They need to be sensitive to what that means for their stability, for their sovereignty, for their own economic interests and other interests. They need to be quite aware of that and sensitive to that. And in the process, they need to see some opportunities there and to appreciate how the world is shaping up in different ways. And they need to be adjusting to that, but that doesn't have to be detrimental to them.
Dr. Dan, we're really grateful for having you on Infer Talks today for this conversation.
I'm really happy to be with you. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you so much for staying with us through this conversation with Dr. Daniel Markey. Our team works very hard to make this work possible. And it would mean the world to us if you could like and share our content to show your support. And if you'd like to stay informed on upcoming podcasts and other work, please hit the bell icon.